All right, this is our second mini lecture and PowerPoint on 1 Corinthians, our theme of correction for an immature church. In the first PowerPoint, we talked about the city of Corinth and the founding of the church on Paul's second missionary journey. Now we're going to see the historical context of the Corinthian letters, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, both of which took place on Paul's third missionary journey. So let me describe that journey briefly to you. Paul returned from having established the church in Corinth. He returned to Jerusalem and then back up to Antioch. And on the way home from that second missionary journey, he had stopped briefly in Ephesus. And he preached the gospel there, and those who were there, the Jews who were there, wanted him to stay and continue preaching. He knew he needed to get back to Jerusalem. And so he said he would come back. He promised to come back. And sure enough, he did. After returning and meeting with the church in Jerusalem and in Antioch, he returned to Ephesus. Ephesus was the most important, most significant city in Asia Minor. You can see it there on the map. Paul spent 3 years ministering in Ephesus, longer than anywhere else in any of his missionary journeys. And from Ephesus, he sent disciples to preach, and he reached the whole of Asia Minor. Luke tells us that in Acts, that he used, and Paul would often do this, he used Ephesus as a base of operations, and then went out and himself evangelized various cities and towns, and then sent his disciples to do that as well. And most of those 7 churches that the book of Revelation is written to were probably started during this time. Churches like Laodicea and Hierapolis and Pergamum and Colossae. We know that Colossae was started by one of Paul's disciples, a man named Epaphras. So Paul is ministering in Ephesus during this 3-year period when he hears a report that there is trouble at Corinth. He hears it from 2 main sources. We learn this from 1 Corinthians, from a group of people he refers to as Chloe's people. Chloe is a woman's name, and so Chloe was probably a businesswoman from Corinth, and some of her servants or business associates were traveling to Ephesus, and she sent a report to Paul about some of the trouble that was brewing at Corinth. The other group, we see there is a 3-man delegation made up of a man named Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. They're referred to in 1 Corinthians 16:7. So Paul has been hearing about trouble at Corinth, issues at Corinth, and so in response to those reports from various members of the church at Corinth, he writes 1 Corinthians, correction for an immature church. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the outline and structure of the letter in a bit, but what I want to do first of all is I want to survey all of the letters to Corinth. I say all of the letters because we know there are more than just 2. We have 2 letters, of course, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, but in fact, in each of those letters, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, Paul refers to another letter. So we know there were at least 4 letters written to the church at Corinth. And now we can't call these 4 letters 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 3 Corinthians, and 4 Corinthians, because that would just confuse with what we already have as 1 Corinthians. So scholars refer to these by letters instead. Corinthians A, B, C, D, and then we'll talk about a 5th letter, a potential 5th letter, which is Corinthians E. So let me just summarize what these letters are. In 1 Corinthians, Paul refers to another letter. It was evidently a short letter meant to respond to the issue of immorality in the church, probably written from Ephesus. We don't know for sure, but how do we know this letter existed? Is because of 1 Corinthians 5:9. Paul says, I have written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Now, he goes on to say that he doesn't mean not to associate with unbelievers. They should associate with unbelievers. How can they reach them for Christ if they don't? What he said in that letter is you should not associate with believers who were claiming to be believers but were acting in an immoral way. So that letter, which is referred to in 1 Corinthians, we call Corinthians A. Then we come to Corinthians B, which is 1 Corinthians. Paul hears these reports that things are not being settled yet, that there are more problems, and so he writes a lengthy letter, which we call 1 Corinthians, dealing with problems in the church and then responding to questions from the church. We'll talk about that as the basic outline of 1 Corinthians. 2 points. 1, problems, 2, questions. We'll do that. We'll come back to that. Actually, a third letter. It's referred to in 2 Corinthians. We refer to it as Corinthians C, or often, sometimes it's called the severe and sorrowful letter. And let me tell you about the context of this letter, how it took place. The problems of 1 Corinthians were obviously not solved by Paul's first visit. And so there were more problems brewing, so he decided he needed to visit Corinth to straighten some of these issues out. So he crossed over by ship, most likely, and visited Corinth. But while he was there, the church basically rejected his authority. There were a few leaders in the church who were opposed to Paul, and they rallied the church behind them, and they basically ran Paul out of town. So here's the church that Paul started. He is run out of town from it. He returned to Ephesus, hurting emotionally, in great distress. And so he wrote them a letter. He refers to it in 2 Corinthians 2:4. He says, "For I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart, and with many tears." So that severe and sorrowful letter was sent. It was sent by his associate, his disciple Titus. And then he gave Titus very specific orders. He said, "Titus, I want you to deliver the letter, get their response, head back north to Macedonia, and then cross over to Troas. If I don't see you in Troas, I will head north from Ephesus to northern Asia Minor. If I don't find you in Troas, I will cross over and I will meet you in Macedonia." So Paul is intending to meet Titus in Troas, which is on the Turkey side, or Macedonia, which is on the Greece side. He went north, he tells us in 2 Corinthians, and he did not find Titus in Troas, so he crossed over the Aegean, and he found Titus in Macedonia. And Titus gave a positive report that the church had responded to Paul's letter, that they had repented, and once again were following Paul's authority as an apostle. And so he sat down to write 2 Corinthians. Well, it's second chance for a corrected church, because that's easy to remember. Corinthians, C-O-R, so the 1 Corinthians is correction for an immature church, and 2 Corinthians is second chance for a corrected church. So Paul is reconciled to the church at Corinth. 2 Corinthians is all about the conflict that he had with them, and then the reconciliation, and then the joys of the Christian ministry. Paul also talks in 2 Corinthians about the collection he's taking up for the poor in Jerusalem, something we'll hit on in 1 Corinthians as well. Now, there's a potential fifth letter as well. In chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians, there is a dramatic change in tone, a radical change in tone. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul seems to suddenly be angry with the church again and to rebuke them once again. And he may be just turning to rebuke those leaders who are still opposing him. Others, though, think that maybe that severe and sorrowful letter, or a fifth letter, has been attached to 2 Corinthians 1 through 9. That 2 Corinthians 1 through 9 is one letter, and 10 through 13 is another that's been attached. If that's the case, then we have a fifth letter, Corinthians E, made up of 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. You can see it described there. Hypothetical fifth letter comprising the last 4 chapters of 2 Corinthians. A brief summary of what I just said with a map to show what happens here. This is the context of 2 Corinthians. Paul crosses over to Corinth to make a visit. You can see that arrow crossing over from Ephesus on the right to Corinth on the left. His authority is rejected, and so he returns to Ephesus, very hurt by the church that has just rejected his authority. He sends Titus then with his sorrowful letter. Titus delivers the letter. Paul goes north to Troas. You can see that first blue arrow heading north. When he can't find Titus in Troas, he crosses over to Macedonia in northern Greece. He misses Titus in Troas. He meets Titus in Macedonia. And from Macedonia, on Paul's third missionary journey, he writes 2 Corinthians, which we have seen the theme as second chance for a corrected church. All right, let's go back to 1 Corinthians now. We've talked about the situation, the life setting that provoked 1 Corinthians, the report from members of the church, from Chloe's people, from that three-man delegation. Now let's talk about some of the issues that provoked the problems that Paul is responding to in 1 Corinthians. And we'll be brief here. We'll talk more about this as we go through the letter. One issue at Corinth is the distinction between rich and poor, the social and economic situation. Corinth was a great capitalistic center, entrepreneurial spirit. You have a crossroads of major business, trade, and government, so you've got lots of people trying to make money. So there were some very rich people in Corinth, and like with large metropolitan centers, there were also some very poor. And this does become a significant issue in the letter, especially in chapter 11 with reference to the Lord's Supper. So these economic differences in Corinth are one of the reasons for the divisions that are provoking divisions. And Paul calls for an egalitarian spirit at Corinth, that all are equal in Christ. And this idea that some would celebrate the Lord's Supper with a big feast on their own and not invite the poor, that is just horrific, because we are all one in Christ. So the unity of the body of Christ is partly related to social and economic situation. Another major problem, an issue that provoked many of the problems, or a major issue that provoked many of the problems at Corinth, were the fundamental worldview differences between Judaism and the pagan Greek world. And I've just mentioned three of these, and many of the problems and issues we encounter in Corinth are related to three worldview issues. The first, letter A there on the PowerPoint, is a dualistic Greek worldview. Dualism can mean a lot of different things. In this context, dualism means a distinction between the material world, the physical world, and the spiritual world, or the world of ideas. It goes back to Platonic philosophy, the philosophy of the great philosopher Plato. In its religious version, though, dualism says basically that the material world is evil, is in fact evil, and the spirit world is good. And the best thing you can possibly do is to forget the issues of this physical world and focus on the spiritual world. Now, if you get that philosophy, that the material world is evil and the spiritual world is good, it can result in two different directions. On the one hand, it can result in what we call hedonism, which is just seeking constantly pleasure, nothing but pleasure. If in fact what we do to our bodies has no relevance for our spiritual state, we may as well live it up. And that's what some of the Corinthians were doing. So this dualistic worldview was resulting in hedonism. Others, however, would say that no, because the spirit world is all that counts, you should deny all of the pleasures of life. You should become ascetic. An ascetic is someone who denies pleasures and seeks to live as simple and unadorned life as possible. And so we have that going on at Corinth. Some people saying you should not marry because you should live a life of celibacy without the pleasures of marriage. So a dualistic Greek worldview in Corinth was resulting on the one hand on people saying we can do whatever we want, let's live it up. On the other hand, some people claiming a higher spiritual state because they lived a life of self-denial. A second fundamental worldview issue at Corinth that provoked some of the problems in the church was that they were enamored by Greek wisdom and rhetoric. The Greeks loved education, they loved philosophy, the ability to defeat your opponent in debate because of your great wisdom, your great rhetorical ability was highly praised and highly prized in the Greek world. And Paul encounters this. He has a simple message of the gospel. He's not a great public orator. In fact, he talks about this in both 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, how his appearance, they say, is not that good. He's not that great up front. And the Greeks, in some sense, are rejecting him because they are enamored with this idea of Greek wisdom and rhetoric. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says that God has made all the wisdom of this world foolishness. And he's referring to this Greek enamoring of wisdom and rhetoric. The true wisdom of God, he says, is the cross of Christ, which is foolishness to Greeks, foolishness to Jews as well. But to those who are being saved, it's the power of God for salvation. So that's a second worldview issue at Corinth. A third we've called over-realized eschatology, and that big theological term basically is related probably to this dualistic worldview. Over-realized eschatology basically says that we have arrived, spiritually speaking. We are already there. We have reached a higher spiritual status. Eschatology refers to the end times or our final salvation, and so it's basically saying we have arrived spiritually. Our physical bodies don't matter because it's only what's spiritual that matter. And that seems to be causing some of the issues and problems. All right, so once again, we've got social and economic situation. We've got some fundamental worldview issues at Corinth. A third key issue that is provoking problems may be a growing conflict between Paul and the Corinthians. Now, you might remember when I talked about 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians is all about this conflict with Paul, between the church and Paul, where some of the leaders at Corinth are rejecting Paul's authority. But some scholars, and particularly Gordon Fee, and if you're using his commentary, his New International Commentary, he really brings this out. If you read the introduction, you'll see this. Fee thinks that already in Corinth there is conflict between Paul and the church. And basically, when Paul is responding to questions and problems at Corinth, he's really calling them to submit to his authority with reference to these issues. And he's calling them to respect his authority because they are presently rejecting his authority. So this is one view that basically 1 Corinthians is provoked. It's not so much, think of it as Paul, the pastor, correcting this struggling church. That's sort of the traditional view. Here Paul is correcting this church that's struggling. Fee's view is basically that Paul and the Corinthians are already in conflict, and Paul is asserting his authority with the Corinthians, trying to call them back to submission to that apostolic authority and obedience to the gospel that they have believed in. So we'll deal with that as we go along, and you can try to, as we look at each issue, you can kind of put it through that filter and see if that's what you think, Paul, that this conflict that becomes full-blown in 2 Corinthians is already becoming an issue in 1 Corinthians. All right. One more point here with reference to the occasion and situation. As we said at the very beginning, 1 Corinthians is extremely practical for the church today. And as we hit these various issues, we will see that there are issues that are of great relevance for the church today. And why is that? Well, it's because our society is characterized by many of the same problems and issues that the Corinthians had. Casual immorality, this is the idea that you can do whatever you want with your body and it just doesn't make that much difference. I saw a bumper sticker the other day that says, I hope there's beer in hell. And here's the idea that it doesn't really matter. Obviously, that person doesn't really believe in hell or in a judgment. Secondly, pride and self-centeredness. We see enormous pride in the Corinthians, in their spirituality, pride in their abilities and in their wisdom. A huge issue today where it's the me generation focused on what can I get out of life rather than focus on others. And then third, what I've called post-Christian spirituality. These days, it's a good thing to be a spiritual person. It's not generally viewed as a good thing to be Christian, but to be a spiritual person, to be in touch with your spiritual side. Well, the Corinthians are enamored by spirituality, but it's not necessarily a mature biblical spirituality. All right, we've called the theme, as I mentioned before already, correction for an immature church. It may also be Paul's challenge and conflict with the church and the challenge to his leadership. I just want to conclude this little PowerPoint by talking about the structure, the simple structure of Corinthians. There's two main sections to 1 Corinthians. The first 6 chapters deal with problems in the church. The final chapters 7 through 15, what is that, 7 chapters or 8 chapters, deal with questions from the church in Corinth. We know that each of those sections of questions is a question because Paul says, now concerning the things you wrote about, they wrote to raise issues with Paul. So the issues that are dealt with, we'll just summarize them. The divisions in the church. The first 4 chapters deal with divisions in the church. A question of church discipline. The church is not disciplining someone who is acting in an immoral manner. The challenge of lawsuits. The Corinthians are suing each other. Paul calls them to stop doing that. And then the issue of immorality in general, especially manifested in visiting prostitutes. The second half of Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, is about questions from the church. There's a whole long chapter on marriage and divorce, the most detailed teaching on marriage, divorce, and singleness in the New Testament. There are 3 chapters on food sacrificed to idols. There are chapters on worship. Chapter 11 especially focuses on propriety in worship. Chapters 12 through 14 deal with spiritual gifts, especially the gift of tongues, and the gift of prophecy. And finally, chapter 15 deals with the resurrection. The Greeks had a different view of resurrection than the Christian view. And then chapter 16, some concluding matters, including the collection of the poor for the Jerusalem church. So 2 major points in the outline: problems at Corinth and questions from Corinth, and then we'll deal briefly with each of these in our lectures ahead. So this concludes this lecture on the introductory issues related to 1 Corinthians.